All right, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the Honest Offense podcast. Today, I am honored to be joined by Rebecca Trent. Rebecca is the owner and operator of the Creek in the Cave Comedy Club, which recently moved from its longtime home in New York City to Austin, Texas. I think the Creek has been one of the most important comedy stages over the past decade. So I'm really excited to have Rebecca here. Rebecca, thanks so much.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
I want to get started with your background, how you got into comedy in the first place, because I think the general public, the general audience might think that if you own a comedy club, it's probably because you love comedy. But I mean, my experience at least has been there's a lot of club owners out there who got into it either just because it was a good business move or maybe the club was in the family. But just from kind of seeing you and seeing the Creek in the Cave, it seems like you really do have a passion for the art of comedy. Can you tell me how you got into it?
When I bought the Creek in August of 2006, I had two business partners and I had them both, I had bought both of them out by December of 2007. And then we went full comedy. Before that, we were kind of like a dive bar that did reggaeton parties and had DJs. And we tried doing, having like regular like musicians, like doing rock and roll and stuff. And the space couldn't take it sound wise. And then we started doing theater because my background's in theater. We couldn't get it. We didn't have the budget to make any kind of production quality. And it was just kind of like, it felt silly. Like we were so close to Broadway. Like, what are we doing? You know?
Right.
And, you know, the musicians tagged up the neighborhood. The actors were really demanding and kind of rude. And I started working with this guy named John F. O'Donnell, who just came in and pitched me and asked me if I would do a comedy show. And at first I was like, no. And then I met his partner, who was this really sweet guy who I got really great vibes off of, who is from South Dakota. And my ex-husband's from South Dakota, sort of. He lived in South Dakota for a long time. And there's just something cool. Like people from South Dakota are generally like pretty laid back and cool, right, and like good to work with, you know? So when I met, his name's Timmy Williams. So when I met Timmy, I was like, okay, yeah, let's do this. And we started the show. They started the show called Kingdom of Heaven. And they had a comedian of merit on. And in the first, it was a weekly show. And in the first month, I think it was Tom McCaffrey, Andre DeBouchet, Anthony Jeselnik, and I can't remember who the fourth, Eric Andre. So it was like killer comics. Yeah. And this is like back in like 2008, really. And it was just amazing. And so from there, we started booking more and more comedy and eventually just switched over to full comedy fairly quickly, honestly. Like I said, like as soon as, because my business partners didn't want to do that. So like as soon as they were gone, it was like, all right, now we're doing it. So yeah, and it's also just such an incredibly under advocated for art form. There's no end game with this industry. There's no retirement plan, I guess, right, I should say. You know what I mean? And there's no like emergency funds like they have for actors. Like, you know, like the arts are pretty much taken care of to some degree, with the very obvious and gross exception of comedy. Wow. Stand-up comedy is just not respected. And so I really felt like I'm one of those people who likes to go where they're needed. And I feel like I felt like at the time that building a community with this particular group of artists, specifically with like Sean Patton and Zach Sims and Neil Stasny and Mark Normand and working with like Donald Glover and DC Pearson, like that I was offering something that was useful. I was making myself useful, you know? So getting to work with them, especially in the sort of developmental stages, is just an unbelievable honor. It was just absolutely unbelievable. And, you know, from there, we continued to do more and more work. We, in comedy, we started a podcast network that launched a handful of really popular podcasts that are still on air today. We were Christine Evans and I created What's Your Fucking Deal with Big Jay Oakerson. We created it with him. It's a crowd work show that did 2 seasons on CISO. I actually got to, my favorite project that I've ever gotten to work on is kind of twofold. I got to direct Colin Quinn off Broadway and his one-man show called Unconstitutional, and he developed it at the Creek. So I got to work with him for, I think, almost 2 years, and it was absolutely amazing. We did Bleecker Street Theater, we did Cherry Lane. It got extended. It was really popular. I got a review in the New York Times as the director, which was insane. Give me 1 second.
Sure.
And we started so Colin, and then we started Skankfest at the Creek, and we did that for 2 years at the Creek, and then we moved to the Brooklyn Bazaar for 2 years. And the first year that we were at Brooklyn Bazaar, I was able to bring Colin in, and we did a Tough Crowd reunion, which was so fucking cool. 2017.
Okay.
2017.
I just had Matt Balaker on a couple of weeks ago, who wrote a book on Greg Giraldo, and we talked all about Tough Crowd. I was telling him how that was my favorite show of all time. So is that recorded somewhere, that reunion episode? Can I find that anywhere? Oh
no,
I'm jealous.
It was a secret show. We didn't advertise it at all, and we didn't even tell people in the venue. We just kind of set it up, and people were like, "Oh my God, is this really happening?" Who happened to be in the room at the time, and they went and told their friends, and then their friends, and like, you know what I mean? So like that's so how it got filled up. And there were so many people there that our photographer Mindy Tucker actually couldn't get in the door, so our fans crowd surfed her over to a spot and physically held her up so she could take pictures. And she came up to me afterwards and she was like, "I have never felt so much energy." And it was so, like, I felt so safe. It was so much fun. This was such an amazing experience. And the pictures that she got were absolutely stunning. But yeah, Mindy was the only one who documented it.
That's events like that are where you see the power of comedy and the art of it. There is an energy to a good comedy show that you don't really understand unless you've been to one. And I never thought of that point, that you have things like the National Endowment for the Arts and all of these grants associations that give money to all of these different arts, but there's no institution that supports comedy at a big level. I never thought of it that way.
And before Barry Crimmins passed away, he who was an absolutely beautiful man. Barry was very dedicated to comedians and very dedicated to a lot of other causes. But one of the things that he was interested in at the end of his life was trying to create some sort of a fund, some sort of a retirement fund, like some sort of a process that we could actually sort of like be treated like human beings at the end, you know. But you know, sadly, like everybody that talked about it was just in initial stages, and when he passed on, the conversation kind of died away. Some other comedians have mentioned to me some interest in doing some stuff, and getting clubs to sort of tithe, to pay a tithe to some sort of a fund that could be like an emergency fund.
Yeah.
Because even comedians who are developing, like as they're getting started, they can't, you know, I know a handful of folks that we lost, not because they passed away, but because they just couldn't do comedy anymore for various reasons. You know, they went home to take care of a sick parent or, you know, something. And it would be wonderful if we could figure out a way to also help those developing comedians get over those sort of like speed bumps that life throws our way, because it is so easy to get derailed from this art form, mainly because of the lack of support.
You hear so many stories of comedians, the way they get their start is they grow up wherever, Iowa, South Dakota, they move to New York or they move to LA. without a job, without any kind of support whatsoever, and they just have to find a way to make enough money to pay the rent so that they can
Yeah,
do comedy. There's no outside support in that industry.
not at all.
But I have heard so many comedians talk about the Creek. The Creek that I think comedians have a special relationship with in a way that you don't hear them talk about any other clubs. I mean, they've talked about sleeping at the Creek. They've talked about spending Thanksgiving there. Can you talk about how you developed that unique relationship? Especially, I want to hear about, it sounds like it was a tradition that you guys did every Thanksgiving that the comedians would come and spend the holiday there, just because so many people, again, were from out of state, out of the city. They couldn't afford to go home. So that was their home.
Exactly. Like usually, folks who could afford to go home would usually opt to just go home for Christmas instead of Christmas and Thanksgiving. So some years we would have as many as like 75 people, and we would have a team of like 10, maybe 12 folks that would help us cook and like prep and everything. And then we would have a team that would help us clean up, and we would just be open. Some years people would just walk in off the street, and at that point it's like, of course, come grab a plate. And we made sure that we cooked enough food for everybody to go home and have leftovers, because Thanksgiving leftovers is the best part,
Right.
So we would cook like 7 turkeys. We would do like a truffle glaze baked bacon wrapped turkey. That one was for Joseph Roberts. And we would and he also was our fryer, so we would fry turkeys as well. We air fried the last 2 years. I'm gonna miss that air fryer. That air fried turkey was so good.
That changed my life, getting an air fryer. That thing's the most amazing invention.
Everybody talks about it. I don't have one, but everybody talks about it. But they and we would do a sage mushroom one. That one was for my mom, and my mom would come up every year, and we would just bang it out, and it was so much fun. I made a seafood stuffing that knocked Tim Dillon's socks off. We would do because the day before,
that's an impressive feat. I've heard him talk about food before. He's not easily impressed.
He's not easily impressed. I would cook I would do a lobster boil the day before with like 25 or 50 lobsters, depending on what my budget was, which it was usually 25.
Sure.
And everybody that was there that happened to be there that night could eat their fill. Like we would just set out some lobsters, and then I would take all of the shells and make a lobster broth. And with the lobster broth, and then like the meat of maybe like 5 or 10 lobsters, and I would cut all that up and mix it in with like shrimp and sometimes snow crab, and like mix it all together in like a cornbread. It's so good. It was so good. I'm so hungry. So we had and we had really slamming food, and Hannah Harkness would bring in our mac and cheese, and before that Shannara. We had just amazing things, like James Adomian would come and we would cook his favorite stuff. Andy Letterman's family came. Andy Sanford's mom came. Like we would have it was literally like anybody that wanted to come. I was so nervous the first year that Sean Patton, or I think it was maybe the only year that Sean Patton's parents, Tom and Becky, came, because his dad is like the premier caterer for New Orleans. And so like, you know what I mean? And he really liked the food. So I was like, okay, we did it.
We're legit.
But yeah, so we did that every year, and we would do a Christmas, like a much smaller thing for Christmas. And I mean, it came about because I didn't have anything to do on the holidays. I don't remember if my mom was there the first couple of years that we did it, but we did holiday meal there every year for Thanksgiving and almost every year for Christmas.
So did you grow up a comedy fan? Because I'm trying to figure out, I've done a little bit of theater myself, and in my experience, there's not a lot of overlap between theater kids and people who appreciate, Tim Dillon. So where did that comedy gene come from? Or did you just kind of fall into comedy the way you explained?
No, I mean, so I wasn't allowed to listen to MTV or like music when I was a kid. Like my parents weren't, or like I could listen to their music, but like right. I couldn't, like, I remember when Papa Don't Preach came out, my mom like flipped out, and I didn't even know what the fucking song was about. And my mom flipped out and she was like, you can't listen to music. And then MTV was off limits, and VH1 was off limits. And I wasn't allowed to watch The Simpsons either because they were too disrespectful. And they weren't. And what's funny is that my mom's not like super strict. Like I smoke pot in front of her now. Like we're a super close relationship. So it's not that. But I don't know. Like the music just threw them. So but stand up was fine. I could listen to stand up all I wanted to. And it was weird because like, I mean, I saw Eddie Murphy raw. I mean, like some of filthy stuff, but like for whatever reason, as long as there wasn't music behind it, it wasn't like in a chorus, it was all right. I don't know. It was very weird. I think
everyone's parents have their one weird thing. Yeah. Like, okay, that's the rule.
Yeah, that was the rule. So, like I premium blends, and like I was a Comedy Central junkie. I mean, I watched every episode of Craig Kilborn, even in the Daily Show, like in the inaugural seasons or whatever. And I was obsessed. I mean, when Tough Crowd came out, like I loved Tough Crowd, and you can only watch them, like people recorded them awkwardly while they were watching it on their TV, and you can watch those on YouTube, and that's kind of the only place you can get them anymore.
Yep.
I would beg Comedy Central to release them because I know so many people that would love those DVDs.
I just had this conversation with Matt when we were talking about Tough Crowd. I said, I don't know why this show, you can't find it anywhere other than these crappy recordings, secondhand recordings on YouTube.
I mean, it's Patrice, it's Geraldo. Like, it's like, you can't, brilliant. I mean, it like, Colin like steering that ship was just so brilliant. It was such a great show. It was such a great show, and it's such a shame that it was only 2 seasons.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that like it could probably never exist again.
Oh, so, absolutely not. Could you imagine?
Yeah. I mean, that's why we don't record them. We don't record anything at Skankfest. And
I think that's the way you have to do it now. And there's more and more comedians that are doing the thing where you stick your phone in the bag and you can't open your phone.
I do that at my club. Every show. Every artist has the option. I don't force it on anyone, but every artist has the option. And if one person on the lineup wants it, then we really encourage everybody to sort of be on board about it.
How long ago did you start doing that?
You know what? Joe Rogan started coming to the club. So whenever his first date was, he brought in the bags for that show. And then after that, I just was like, hey, is this something that we can use every day?
Yeah.
And
it makes
so
sense.
we just started a relationship with Yonder.
It's a way to protect the art, because
100%.
When you see these clips that get put online that are completely out of context, and you hear the audience laughing, you know that the show's going well, that the joke's landing, that people are understanding the context in the show, but then you post a 30-second clip on Twitter and no one has any context for it, and now you're taking it like it's literal, like it's a senator giving a speech.
Yeah, no, I mean it's ridiculous. I mean, there's I take the ownership of the material serious, and I don't take the material serious. You know what I mean? Like, in a way, right?
Yeah.
So for me, I feel like there's really no scenario where any fan should be putting up any material whatsoever of any comedians ever. There's just no scenario where that's okay. And I will go so far as to be like, I need to see the tape. Did you get more than just that person? And if they say yes, then my security guys will stand with them while it gets either deleted or edited.
Oh, I love that. You've actually done that when you've seen someone take their phone out.
No, I've we've had people ask, can I tape my set? And then you say yes. And then that's, you can't keep taping after your set's over.
Yeah.
So,
I love that.
I mean, it just, and we pull smartphones, or we pull the smartphones and bag those, but we also bag the watches, because you can record with the watches too.
Yeah. And I think that's the only way to do it. I mean, we live in this world now where everyone has recording devices on, and so you don't want people recording the show. This is the only way to ensure people aren't recording the show, and you need the comics to feel comfortable, to know that, hey, whatever I'm 100%. Doing here, I can try out, and it's not going to leave these walls.
exactly. And it's not just that, it's also it's like what you said, the tryout. There's a couple of things that has to be in place for comedy to thrive and survive, right? One thing that's incredibly important is, and this is something that I used to talk with Donald Glover about a lot, is permission to fail.
Yeah.
You have to be allowed to take risks. You have to be allowed to go on stage and say the wrong thing so that you can get to the right thing, right? So that's the number one thing. And oh shit, I completely forgot what the number two thing was. It was permission to fail. And you have to have, especially for stadium comedians or comedians that are performing in arenas or larger theaters like the Paramount, you have to have a workout room. You have to have a room that's 200 seats or less, where you can go and try out stuff on an audience, on a fresh audience, on an audience that is probably paying maybe a little bit less on ticket price, but is getting an experience of watching a comic work, right? So I feel like those two things are incredibly vital in order for comedy to thrive, and not having that is what makes some markets a little bit less relevant than others.
Yeah. When you have a young Donald Glover, I don't know when you first met Donald Glover, because he got successful pretty young writing for 30 Rock. But when he comes into the club, or Tim Dillon or Mark Norman, any one of these guys, when they're first starting out, do you know that, oh, this guy's going to be big? Like, how early can you tell this guy's on a track to really be successful? Or does everyone kind of have to follow
I think everybody's kind of different, you know? I mean, like, you could tell right away. I feel like everybody could tell right away with Donald, with Tim Dillon, with Michael Che.
Yeah.
I mean, the truth is that there are some people that are God touched, that are Jedis, you know, in this industry, and then there are some folks that have to work a little bit differently and have a different kind of process, and you know, their path might be a little bit more uphill at first, but I feel like the path of the people who we just mentioned, that it goes very uphill once you get to that level of success.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
It gets harder and harder to sort of maintain.
It gets kind of stratified, because it's, I mean, you can work a certain number of years to become a headliner, but then now if you want to be doing arenas, now that's the next level. And if you want to do
exactly
TV or movies, which not
every step gets a little bit harder. Yeah.
I want to ask you about how you came across the Legion of Skanks, how that got started, because that's one of my favorite shows. I love those guys. How did they get started at the Creek?
Well, Jay Oakerson's a tough crowd comic, number one. So that's key, right? No, I had known Jay for a while. Lewis and I had met like a couple of times. Dave and I were friends. And I honestly didn't even realize like that they were all such close friends, because I would see them like when they were booked at different stuff, and so they weren't necessarily like all, you know, they weren't necessarily the threesome that you see now, right? So they had tried to do Legion of Skanks over. Oh, and also very important, I'm super close friends with Christine Evans and have been for ages. So Christine called me up one day because they didn't have the tech that they needed in order to do the podcast at the spot that they wanted to do it, which I believe was at the Stand, but the location that they had before this one, when they were over by that Irish bar. I don't remember. I'm not good with direct, like 23rd Street. I don't know, maybe. So they didn't have like the tech. There wasn't enough tech support, or they couldn't. There was something that they couldn't figure out the recording over there or something. And it's something that we'd been doing for ages. So Christine called me and was like, "Hey, do you mind if we come do it?" So they came, and originally it was being done up in the big theater, and you know, on an off night or whatever, probably I think Wednesday. And so we started doing it in the big theater. Oftentimes, Christine and I were the only two people in the audience. The first time, Lewis hadn't smoked weed in probably like a few months, or at least 6 weeks or something. Yeah. Right. And so he comes in and we smoke up in the studio before we go up to do the podcast. So we smoke up, everybody's having a good time, we're all stoned. We get upstairs, and Lewis, they start the podcast, and like 30-40 minutes in, the motherfucker just fell asleep. It was absolutely hilarious. He fell asleep during his own podcast, the first one that he did at the Creek. Christine and I still laugh about that. But so they just asked, and we had them so they had their own night, and they performed up in the theater for a while, and then eventually they moved down into the studio and started just doing recordings in the studio with like a smaller live audience, and then moved out into the garage area and started doing it once a week. And it worked really, really well for a long time. And they were there for about 7.5 years. And then we moved it over to a Monday, and right before Skankfest, it was July 10th, I believe. Right before Skankfest, we had a podcast where, do you know Pete and Repeat from Nickelodeon?
The old Pete and Pete show. Yeah. I grew up watching that. Yeah.
Pete and Pete.
Yeah.
So Pete and Pete were, one of the guys from Pete and Pete were there as the guest, and a neighbor of mine who lived in the area grabbed a microphone away from the guest, Pete. I don't know what his real name is. Grabbed the microphone away from him and started hollering about how Legion of Skanks is like a bunch of negative stuff about Legion of Skanks, and pointed out that there was a Proud Boy in the audience. And there was a guy in the audience that was wearing a Proud Boy hat, which by the end of that night, I became the owner of, and he apologized and like wasn't even from, he was from Alaska, and he was a young guy who had just come into he was a fan of Skankfest. He had a pass to see Skankfest. Respectful the entire weekend, like whatever, and like literally I talked to him for probably like 4 hours, and I was like, what's the fucking problem here? Like, you just need to like belong to a club. Let's talk about this,
right.
you know? And you know, misguided, sure. And probably like a little sheltered, a little isolated. But you know, seems all in all like a nice kid who's capable of rehabilitation. Right.
Right.
But this guy, what happened was Christine and I were working in my office and listening to Legion of Skanks. So we had like a 5 or 10 second delay. We were listening to it on the feed, and we were working on stuff, and we heard a fight start, and we ran out, and we were a little bit later. So we go out, and what I see off to the left is a guy doing Sieg Heil, right? And this is the guy who grabbed the microphone. So that guy's off to the left, like over by the bar. And Lewis is being held back by his 2 Jewish friends,
right?
Jay and Dave, are like holding him back. And Lewis is trying to get the kid to come near him so he can fight him. So he's calling him the F word over and over again and trying to incite a riot. While that's happening, there are people playing pinball who are gay, and there are people upstairs doing a really amazing improv show called Kaleidoscope. That was one of my favorite things at the Creek. It was the longest running thing we had at the Creek. The host of whom is also homosexual. And I don't know who the host is now, so I'm not outing anyone, but just the person at that time.
Sure.
So I came out, that's what I saw. I immediately told the guy, his name was William. I told William that he needed to pay his tab and get out. And he was like, I thought you were a good person. You're a bad person. I hate you.
Saying this to you?
And he was like, I'm going to call the police. And I was like, dude, in the time that the police get here, Lewis will have already snapped your neck. Like, you got to get out of here. How do you not see that they're holding him back right now? Because the whole time he's screaming, right? Yeah. And like, they get Lewis like in the back room, and Jay comes up and he's like, man, you can't be here. Like, you got to dip, right? So he finally, like, you know, he's like shaking. Like, I mean, he's shaken. I don't think he expected it to be such a thing. And he went upstairs. There were a bunch of people outside. He kind of chased him down the block. Like, he got out of there. And then a couple of weeks later, we were all in Montreal for Just for Laughs. A couple of weeks later, this guy posted like a manifesto, like a one-pager, saying that I was a Nazi sympathizer and homophobic, saying that Jay had Nazi tattoos, saying that, like, just all of this crazy stuff, like, just kept going on and on. And just like this one pager, and he put it up all over my neighborhood. And I was on the community board. I live in my neighborhood. I eat in my, like, I run the restaurant association. Like, Long Island City's like, I was a part of Long Island City. You know what I mean? So for that to happen and for him to do that, and I don't know that he knew this or not, but for him to do it while I was out of town, like, I literally had to call my friend called me and she was like, do you have any idea? And Lewis was the one who posted on Instagram. That's how I found out about it. I was like, I don't know what this is about. And she was like, well, I've got a bunch of people going around the neighborhood tearing them down. So Sheila was the one who ended up taking them all down. And I mean, this guy spit on me. We got vandalized. People spray painted Nazis not welcome on the front of my building. I can't remember if that happened then or if that happened during the Milo thing. But anyway, that was the first thing that happened with Legion of Skanks. And then
what year was that?
I think that was the first year that we were at Brooklyn Bazaar, so 2015, okay. I think.
And
yeah, that makes sense.
Was the next big thing the Milo thing? The next big controversy?
The next Legion of Skanks controversy was the Milo thing. So Lewis posted, I don't pay attention to who books, like, and I don't mean this in like a I don't care kind of way. Right. I mean this like in a podcast book their own podcast.
Right.
Like, very rarely does a booker get involved in that. Like, I book the club, so I book the podcast to come, but I don't book the actual podcast.
Yes, yeah.
So they put up a thing saying that Milo was coming, and I didn't know who he was, and I was like, oh wow, that's gonna be fun watching Lewis try and pronounce that last name. You know what I mean? Like that literally, like that was all you thought, right? And I started getting phone calls and messages from people on Facebook just being like, you can't do this. You don't have any idea. Like, what are you doing? And I was like, what do you mean? What am I doing? Who is this guy? And I, like, honestly, literally didn't even know what a Breitbart was until I started like looking into it. And
Lewis said the same thing. Lewis said he had no idea. He just knew Milo was just this guy.
He just knew he was controversial.
Right.
That's all. Yeah. So I mean, it is what it is. At the end of the day, the situation was solved on its own. I had called the day before and asked Jay, I was like, look, do you care if you just do this one in the studio? Because I really don't think this is a good idea. And he was like, yeah, I don't care. No big deal. And so I called Lewis and I was like, look, I talked to Jay. I think that we need to table this. You know, do it in the studio if you really have to, or maybe don't do it, dude. Like, it's not necessary. And he was like, just wait, just give it a day. And at the time I was going to Rikers 3 times a week. And when you go to Rikers, you do not have your cell phone on you. You have to put it in a locker, and then you have to take a bus over to the facility to do the visitation.
Okay.
And the process can take anywhere from 4 hours to, like, I mean, the longest I think I was there was like 8.5 once. Like, I almost missed the last bus out kind of shit. And you can only get there by bus. Like, it's like a whole process. Right. So I didn't have my phone on me. And when I got out, Lewis had left me like a shit ton of messages, and Jay had called me and Christina called me, and I didn't know what was going on. And basically Milo's team was like, you can't just show up in public somewhere. There's no security. Like, I don't even have a security guard. Our cameras didn't even work. You know what I mean? Like, this is the environment would not, the environment would not be safe. Would not be safe for Milo. It would not be safe for the Legion of Skanks guys. Like, it's just not safe. You know, we don't have precautions in place to allow for this level of controversy, right? And Milo's team recognized that, and they were the ones who were like, unless the venue is willing to pay like $320,000 in security, then there's no way we can do it. And I was,
Right.
and Lewis obviously didn't even call or ask me. Like, he was just like, yeah, that's not happening. Okay, cool, never mind.
Right.
You know what I mean? So like, so that basically is what that boiled down to. And I mean, I got tons of phone calls from people saying that they were going to throw milkshakes and they were going to do this, that, and the third. And it's like, hey, you know, the other part of it too is that, like, I'm telling y'all where he is. Come get him.
Yeah.
I don't care. You know what I mean? Like, what's that saying? Like, if you're not inciting a riot, you're not doing your job well enough. That's what they used to say for theater kids. So I mean, like, you know, it is what it is, but that situation was one of those ones that, like, I kind of got dunked into without having any kind of, like, you know, because I come from my family's conservative. My father's a Fox News guy. So I was so inundated with that growing up that I kind of very intentionally ignore that shit. I don't really pay any attention to it. And it's not because I don't think that there are people on both sides who have valid points and blah, blah, blah. It's just that I just got saturated in it so much when I was younger that I just, like, you know, it's literally just on TV 24 hours a day at my father's house. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like, it's a lot. There's a lot of art dedicated to the Civil War, you know. It's a very intense experience. It's a very conservatively intense.
Was your dad a veteran?
Experience.
It sounds like my dad's house.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm a military brat.
Okay.
Yeah.
Same here. That's so when you're going through that, or even, you know, like the situation back in 2015, like, are you panicking? Like, what's going on in your head when people are calling you Nazis and spreading posters around your neighborhood?
I'm sad. I mean, like, people who are very close friends of mine, people who, you know, vacationed with me, people who I loved very dearly, were so upset with me that we don't have the same relationships that we used to. You know, I lost a lot of programming. A lot of people felt like having Legion of Skanks there was creating an unsafe environment for people. And that's not how I felt. It's not how I feel. I have had Legion of Skanks at the club since it's opened in Austin. We're doing Skankfest on the 5th. Oh, it starts on the 5th of November in Houston. You know, they are some of my closest friends, and they are some of the best people that I've worked with, and they're loyal and they're steadfast and they love each other very much. And, you know, they're great parents, all of them. It's just, it really bothers me how much people get judged. I remember I went to a lunch, gosh, this was years ago, with some folks from, like, a regional office of Live Nation. And one of the people at the meeting was talking about how incredible it was, like, going on tour with these musicians and how insane they were and all this crazy stuff they would do. And, like, just, I mean, and some of those stories were fucking crazy. Sure. And then I mentioned that I was working with a certain comic that had fallen out of favor. And they were like, oh no, we would never work with him. And it's like, you literally just told me about your serial rape orgy partying cocaine fueled psychotic summer that you had, like this crazy fucking summer. And all that's fine. Why? Because they strum a fucking guitar. It's so weird to me that the standard that we hold comedians to is very different than the standard we hold musicians to, and very different from the standard that we hold. It's odd to me. And I don't understand it. Maybe it's because they engage too much. Right. Like, when people are critical, don't say anything back.
Right. Well,
I mean, like, but it was really fucking sad. And it was sad to find out how many friends were willing to sort of throw me under the bus because they wanted to get the likes. And a lot of times it was comics that, like, kind of weren't going to make it, you know what I mean? But if people speculated about me on the internet before I even knew what was going on, and I was like, Like, you have my fucking cell phone number.
Right. Right.
Like, why wouldn't you just call me and be like, hey, are you actually a Nazi? Because no, I'm not. I was there when the wall fell in Berlin. Being called that was particularly offensive because of my background, because I lived in Berlin for 4 years, because I grew up sort of, again, kind of saturated in World War II history. And it's something that I like the book Hitler's Willing Executioners is just absolutely incredible. Like I can't stomach that. The fact that somebody would say that kind of idealism or hatred is something that I would support in any way. And they weren't asking it in a tongue-in-cheek way. They weren't asking it, you know what I mean? They legitimately were speculating on whether or not my politics had changed.
Yeah.
And that's fucking gross. And they asked it like out in the Twitter sphere instead of just being like, hey, are you okay? Do you need a hug? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, so it's like that kind of behavior, it sucks. It sucks that people get mad at me because I support comics that other people think that I shouldn't support. But I still listen to Michael Jackson music. So,
right.
you know, fucking sue me. I don't know what to tell you. You know what I mean? I don't like it when people get violent. I don't like it when people start using hate speech. I don't enjoy that kind of stuff. But I'm not, and I'm not trying to encourage it.
Yeah.
That is not something that's happening.
Yeah.
And to be accused of so many hateful, awful things like that, like, yeah, it hurts my feelings.
Yeah.
You know, I do what I do for love of the game. You know what I mean? And it's hard to love the game as much when you know how many assholes you got on the ship, you know?
How much of your perspective do you think is that military brat background? Because so many people I know, obviously people who actually served, but also people who grew up in military families, you kind of are able to put things in perspective. Like, especially people like me who grew up post 9/11, like I saw my dad going to war. I saw older friends going to war, and you have to like kind of come face to face with actual war and death and that sort of thing. And so people telling offensive jokes just doesn't get me riled up because I'm able to put that in perspective.
I mean, I grew up watching Married with Children, and I remember when there was a housewife, like this sort of thing. They talked about it on the series. Married with Children, by the way, had the first openly gay female sitcom star in the history of the world. Like, they did really amazing stuff. Ed O'Neill is an incredible person. Katie Sagal. I mean, like, these people are just an incredible cast. That episode that they had with Sam Kinison was insane. It was so good. Like, I love that show so much. And it holds up, which is amazing. But I remember, like, there was a woman who wrote in over and over and over and over again. And was counting the times that they made sexual references and trying to get them canceled, trying to get them off the air. And finally, like, Ed O'Neill sort of like in his, like, almost in his most sort of like exhausted Al Bundy was like, could you just change the fucking channel? Just change the channel. Get your remote control out, or tell your little brat to walk up to the TV and change the channel. And that's kind of how I feel about comedy clubs. You know what I mean? It's kind of like Netflix. I don't like everything that's on Netflix. There are plenty of things that are on Netflix that I take exception to, or that I don't want to be a party to. And it's super easy because then I just don't watch that. I just don't watch it.
It's like crazy talk.
It's so I'm gonna write to Netflix and be like, you're only allowed to have the kind of things that I like to watch, and that's it.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And so it feels like there's also a little bit of resentment that there's an audience for it. You know what I mean? But the truth of the matter is that you know, folks who really love a certain kind of comedy are going to be exposed to more kinds of comedy if they go to a place like the Creek. You have a better chance. Like, it's important to have all the kinds of comedy, every kind of comedy, all of them, every single kind. Some of it is comedy that I don't like. You know, I've seen countless hours, terrible improv, countless. But that doesn't matter. That's what love of the game is about. Sometimes you got to watch the other stuff. You know what I mean? And the folks that are amazing improvisers and amazing stand-ups are also usually wildly successful. You know, so I don't know. Like I resent the idea that I have to book a club a certain way, or there can only be a certain kind of thing, or if you do this, then that's bad. It's interesting that today's the day that we find out that Cosby got freed, huh?
Of course. Would you book him?
No.
Why not?
No, I wouldn't. For a couple of reasons. Number one, he's geriatric at this point, and I don't think that. I think that for my personal relationship with for my love of Cosby, I wouldn't want to see him.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like I think it's better for me to remember Bill Cosby himself and remember, and I don't feel that way about Mel Brooks. You know what I mean? So I will admit that the like the pain that he's caused is a distraction. You know what I mean? It would be about that. You know, right. So I personally think that regardless if he's in jail or not, I think it's time for him to take the spurs off.
Yeah. Going back to what you were saying before, like what I loved about Tough Crowd is that you have these guys who are talking about the most serious issues. The show was on right around when we started the Iraq War. They're talking about the Iraq War. They're talking about race relations, and they are attacking each other personally and professionally and attacking each other on these issues. And you know that they're still best friends. They'll still be on the show next week together. And they
literally go to cookouts together. Still.
Right.
Like I like Rich Foss and Bobby Kelly and Bonnie McFarlane and Colin Quinn and Judy Gold and like those they're always hanging out with each other. They are true friends. They go, like it wasn't like false chemistry. You know what I mean? And I mean, I'm sure everybody does, but like, listening to their Patrice stories is really amazing, and their Geraldo stories. It's incredible. But they were incredibly close. And so no, they're roast comics. They don't take any of it personally.
Right.
And every once in a while, maybe something will go a little far and they'll get a little like about it, but then they clap back harder. And then it and everybody sort of like, takes the fangs out at the end of the taping.
Right. That's where the honesty and the comfort comes from is, we're going to go 100% at each other.
Yep.
And we're going to walk away and we're going to put that behind us. And so is that something that's changed? I mean, have you seen that running the club? Has there been a kind of culture change in how people are able to disagree with whether it's politics or whether it's comedy? Like are people more sensitive now than they were when you started, early 2000s?
Well, yes. When you say people in general, I would say yes.
Yeah.
We just had Mike Stanley come in with his buddy, whose name might also be Mike Kobos. Kobos is his last name. They came in and did a roast show called Shots Fired, and it was awesome. I mean, there's tons of comics that are still doing that kind of comedy. I mean, Roast Battle, like all of that stuff is still there. You know what I mean? I think that audiences maybe get a little bit more sensitive. I think certainly, I mean, I don't know if you've seen them lately, but like the rules for like performing in colleges is insane at this point.
When Jerry Seinfeld is too offensive, I've heard Seinfeld say he won't do colleges, and it's like if he's too offensive for colleges, who can perform at colleges then?
Well, I don't even know. Like, they don't want you to talk about sex. They don't want to talk about drugs. They don't want you to talk. Some of them go so far as to say no cursing. It's kind of bananas. Now, I do think that every comic should be versatile, and if they have it in them, they should have a clean set. That's not a bad idea. somebody might want you for, you might decide that doing a cruise for a month or two would be fun, and you have to have clean for that. And there's a couple other, TV, you gotta work clean for television. So I mean, there's value in it. I'm not trying to say that clean comics aren't any good, but or that kind of comedy isn't valid. It definitely is. I just think that audiences have gotten so sensitive. And there's also another way of looking at it. Like, we sort of, as older folks, haven't really figured out that there's a more of a language barrier now, right? And there's also more of a barrier to language now than there was in 2000 and 20 years ago, right? So I think that those two things have contributed to a more sensitive audience, and maybe like a little bit of a shake in confidence for the comedians who do find themselves in those kind of gigs. It's a little bit harder.
Yeah. I wonder where that change is coming from, because like I grew up watching, I noticed it mostly in movies, even more so than stand-up. Like, I grew up with movies, with all those Judd Apatow movies, 40-Year-Old Virgin and Knocked Up and Superbad. And, when I go and I go to the gym and I talk to guys who are like high school, college age now, and I ask them, what are the movies you guys watch? Because these are the movies I watched when I was 18, 19, 20. And they say, no, we still watch those movies, because there's no other comedies being made that appeal to that demographic. So it's like people still have a demand for that sort of thing. It's just not being created for whatever reason. And I don't know if it's the institutions of Hollywood that are withholding it for whatever reason, but I don't accept the argument that the entire audience or culture has changed.
I don't think that it has changed, but I think that the younger you go, the more sensitivity one has to have in order to have a successful set.
Yeah.
How about that?
Yeah.
Is that a better way of putting it?
I'll accept that one. Yeah.
Okay.
I want to talk about the last, year and a half for you guys. Obviously was super tough. You're in New York City. You were in New York City and had, the strictest lockdowns in the country. I mean, here I'm in Indiana. Yeah. Our big comedy club Helium was, closed in March and was able to reopen again in June. We were only closed for a couple months, but you guys were really shut down.
Really?
Yeah. Big Jay was the first. He was the first show back here. We closed.
Yeah, he did go on the road mad early. I forgot about that. Yeah.
We closed, same time as everyone, was like mid-March, and then Jay was the first show back. I think it was like mid-June. It was just 2 months later, 3 months later. And that's
bananas.
Yeah.
So New York was shut down the day before St. Patrick's Day, which was particularly insulting to all the bar owners in the city. We were allowed, so there was a shutdown, full stop, and then we were allowed to open for takeout only, and they allowed to-go drinks. So it was kind of fun, you know what I mean? Like, people were like talking to each other more. I mean, people were definitely, scared, but and then and Long Island City in particular, it was fun because we had the big waterfront over there. There's like a huge park. There's a lot of places so when the nightclubs were closed, that's what became the nightclub, and people just started hanging out there all hours of the night. And the trash situation was insane because everything was in to-go boxes suddenly, you know what I mean? Not a plate was used. So it turned into like just an unbelievable amount of garbage. And then George Floyd happened, the protests picked up. And then in June, we had the week where we were curfewed at 8 p.m. And I almost immediately was down to just one employee, and she worked the kitchen, reworked the recipes as well as we could. And then I did the deliveries and I took the orders. So I answered the phone, I did the deliveries, I handled the money, and bartended. So like I would run out and take something and then run right back and answer the phone, and like, it was bananas. And So we did that for until October. In the meantime, I was producing shows that she was also working at. And we did a taping in October, 1st and 2nd. And then about a week after that, I went home for a little while to see my mom. And about a week after that, I was like, we can't, we need to just stop. We weren't covering costs, food costs. I mean, let alone payroll. Like, you know, nobody was making any money, and it was just keeping it open to keep it open at that point.
Right.
So, I let the landlords know, and they asked me to stay on until they asked me. I decided, I don't know. I turned in the keys on the 1st of December, so it took a while. We did a couple last Legion of Skanks tapings. We did a couple of things, but for the most part, I was just going through 15 years worth of stuff that had just accumulated. Eric Bergstrom had to come and pick up some stuff. Like, everybody who had lived with me had stuff.
Yeah.
Nick Turner still has stuff in my storage unit in Jersey. So like, it took a long time to get everything emptied out. And when we finally did, I turned in the keys on December 1st. And then I went to go take care of my mom for the month of January because she was she got bilateral knee replacement. And so I stayed with her for a month. And in that time, you know, these folks had contacted me and said, oh, you know, we want to start a comedy club in Austin. Do you want to do it? Do you want to do a Creek? We'll bring the marquee. And I was like, yeah, okay, sure. Yeah. And never thinking that they were going to get the money together for it. Well, they did. And they signed the lease on the 1st of February, and I moved down the 1st of March. And then we opened on the 1st of April.
Wow. So it wasn't some big, long plan. This was something that just kind of happened.
Just happened.
And Austin's now becoming a comedy hub. You mentioned like kind of the importance of a comedy hub, and now you have Joe Rogan down there, and he's going to open his own club. Why is it so important to have these hubs of comedy? Because you would think if I was going to open a club, I'd want to do it somewhere, Knoxville, Tennessee, where there isn't some big comedy club. You know, I don't want competitors, but why is it important to kind of have
you have to remember at the time when we all announced, no one knew that Cap City was coming back.
Okay.
Right. So the rooms that were here were mostly like alt rooms. Now there's the Fallout Theater, which had been there before, the Velveeta Room, which had been there before, Esther's Follies, which is predominantly like kids stuff, improv, magic shows, that kind of thing. That's been there before. Big Laughs is at Vulcan Gas Company now. They've only been up for like maybe 5 months.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Sunset Theater. I don't know how long they've been open, but they're doing stand-up shows there. The Roma Room. So there's a handful of rooms that do some programming, but there's not a lot of like proper comedy clubs that do 7 days a week. You know what I mean? That are really dedicated just to that. You know, everything else is like, and we do music, or and we do this, and we do that. So it was a little bit sort of like there were less people, but like honestly, Nashville's an amazing market, and that's an untapped market. New Orleans is an untapped market. I mean, there's a handful of them where you could, like you said, like sort of go in and be like the big dog or whatever. But I also really love the Austin comedy community, you know, and the scene that they have here, mostly thanks to Cap City, is very robust. And they have enough comics to sustain this number of clubs. So at least we're in a big enough market where we aren't all sort of like, you know, scraping to find features and stuff like that.
What's your philosophy for finding people? I mean, you obviously, I was looking at your schedule. You have your weekends where you have your big headliners, but during the week you have a full schedule too of local shows. How do you go about finding people to do those midweek shows or to be features?
I trust comics recommendations. I mean, the same way, like, you know, how like you have to have a couple of recs from another comic in order to get on for SD for the seller.
Right.
It's kind of the same. It's kind of the same thing, you know, like you take recommendations. We also have a full schedule of open mics, so I can see comics sort of initially and see how they work on their feet and stuff. So the same way you always do, you just watch the comics and then pick the ones you like.
Yeah.
And intentionally pick the ones that maybe aren't quite ready yet and give them a challenge and let them rise to the occasion.
Do you miss New York at all, or is it that
Of course I
military
do.
grad? You do, yeah.
It was my 31st move, but New York was the only place I ever felt like I belonged.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, it's a big deal. I lived there for like 20 years.
Yeah.
So leaving New York was an incredibly difficult decision, and it wasn't something that I took lightly. And frankly, not something that I really wanted to do. But at the time, I was delivering for Postmates, and I couldn't make money happen, and I was just sliding so far into debt that I had to take any opportunity that came my way.
Right. And it seems like you're doing well in Austin. Like you kind of hit the ground running.
Definitely hit the ground running, and it's a huge learning curve. Everything's trial by fire, but we're getting there. I feel like we have a really great team. Our servers, my front of house manager, Carrie Lundgren, is absolutely awesome. And Colton Dowling and I are the ones that are the owner operators, and we work together so well. So, I mean, I could not ask for a better group of people to work with.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Rebecca, Trent, thank you so much for your time at the Creek in the Cave in Austin, Texas. I believe your website is creekinthecave.com, correct?
It's just creekandcave.com.
Creekandcave.com. Anywhere else you want to send people?
Skankfest. Go to skankfest.net. And we've got, keep an eye out for Barkfest. That's coming up soon. It's
awesome.
It's a dog-friendly festival in Los Angeles that we're doing.
Oh, that's cool. Well, Rebecca, again, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it. This was great.
Absolutely. Thank you, Eric.